Hello, and welcome to another homework help video. This homework help video looks at calculating the employment rate for an economy given the labor force and number of employed workers. Before looking at how to find the employment rate, let's take a minute to review the concepts of employed workers, unemployed workers, the labor force, and the employment rate. An employed worker is an individual who are employed, that is, they have a job. An unemployed worker is an individual who does not have a job but is actively looking for employment. The labor force is the total number of workers in an economy. It includes individuals who are employed and those who are unemployed and looking for a job. The employment rate is the ratio of employed workers to the labor force. The economists express it as either a decimal fraction or a percentage. For example, the employment rate might be expressed as 91% or 0.91.
If the employment rate is written as a percent of the labor force, the formula is the employment rate equals the number of employed workers divided by the labor force times 100%.
If the employment rate is presented as a proportion or decimal fraction of the labor force, the formula is the employment rate equals the number of employed workers divided by the labor force. In this video, let's represent the employment rate as proportion of the labor force. Now, let's look at how to solve a problem. 1. Write the formula for the employment rate. The employment rate equals the number of employed workers divided by the labor force. 2. From the problem statement, substitute the number of employed workers into the formula for the number of employed workers. 3. From the problem statement, substitute the size of the labor force into the formula. 4. Divide the number of employed workers by the labor force. Now, let's look at a typical problem statement. An economy has a labor force of 110 million, and the number of employed workers is 105.6 million. What is the employment rate? Now, let's find a solution to the problem statement using the process outlined in the previous section. 1. Write the formula for the employment rate. For this example, let's use the proportion formula. The employment rate equals the number of employed workers divided by the labor force. 2. From the problem statement, substitute the number of employed workers into the formula for the number of employed workers. In the example problem statement, the number of employed workers is 105.6 million, so let's substitute 105.6 million into the formula for the number of employed workers. 3. From the problem statement, substitute the size of the labor force into the formula. In the example problem statement, the labor force is 110 million, so let's substitute 110 million into the formula for the labor force. 4. Divide the number of employed workers by the labor force. In the example, the number of employed workers is 105.6 million, and the labor force is 110 million. So, dividing 105.6 million by 110 million is 0.96. So, the country's employment rate is 0.96. This homework help video looked at how to calculate the employment rate as a proportion of the labor force. The solution used the formula, the employment rate equals the number of employed workers divided by the labor force. After substituting the number of employed workers and the labor force into the formula, the employment rate was calculated by dividing the number of employed workers by the labor force. If you want to try a practice problem independently, there is a link in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please put them in the comments section below. Until the next homework help video, best wishes on your economic studies.